other trials with law firms who had gone down for a short period of time. With our help, we had given them templates on how to put together these declarations, on how to put together an asylum brief quickly, and a lot of research already on the front end, and they were also able to win their trials. So by the end of that summer of 2015, the government decided to stop detaining families through their merits hearings or through their asylum trials, because every time that one of these families would win, a lot of reporters were interested. They would feature it on a story in the New York Times or a story in the Chicago Tribune, and so it really flew in the face of the assertions from the government at the time that these families were coming for economic reasons and were not fleeing violence and were not actually asylum seekers. And so at a certain point we thought, great, well, mission accomplished, we can stop now. These families no longer have their asylum trials in detention. But some of the families whose cases we had already started to prepare were being released to areas where they couldn't find legal aid. And so we realized, the crisis isn't over. This was just one small problem that is part of a much larger problem, which is that there aren't enough resources to provide legal aid to asylum seekers coming to the United States, and that especially for people who are in difficult to get to places like a detention center, or like many rural areas in the United States, or even small cities that are under-resourced in those areas, there's just no opportunity to find pro bono services. And so when those families began to leave Dilley, who we had already committed to helping on their cases, we decided that we were going to try to do our best to stay in contact with them, to try to place their cases and make sure that they found pro bono services. And so after these families left, we worked with now one of our board members, Michelle Mendez, to keep in contact with them using a private online community group that has approximately 3,000 formerly detained mothers on it now. And on that group, we have been able to share pro se resources, so resources for mothers who are struggling to get through the immigration process on their own. And we've, in the form of video content, in the form of sort of templates on what to turn into court, but we have also been able to, from there, find out when people have emergencies and play an important role, maybe for a short period of time, in helping them file an application before a deadline, or in the case of many mothers, helping them to overturn a deportation order. And so that's really the next phase in when ASAP's work shifted to doing what we would call post-release work, from post-release from detention. And so we found out that a lot of mothers who had been released from these family detention facilities, not only in Dilley, but in Karnes, Texas, as well as in Berks in Pennsylvania, had been released without a lot of information about next steps in their cases. And so we realized that these families were oftentimes not getting hearing notices to get to court. So we were letting them know when their date in court was, but for many families that was too late. They had already received a deportation order for not showing up to court. There were families who had emergency situations that prevented them from getting to court, and now we're stuck with a deportation order and a letter from ICE or instructions from an ICE officer to report for their deportation. And so panicked, obviously, they weren't able to find legal aid in their communities, even in cities that have traditional nonprofits, because of the fact that it was considered an emergency situation. And so we were able to employ our model of using volunteers to address rapid response legal problems. And so what we did at that point was sort of got all of these volunteers back together. We decided to work on motions to reopen these deportation orders that we were finding out about, and over a period of about a year and a half, worked to overturn over 40 deportation orders. And out of all of those cases, we were successful in all but one, which is still actually pending on appeal. And the way that we were able to do so was, again, using volunteer assistance and breaking down a case, having one volunteer focus on a declaration while another volunteer focused on drafting the motion afterwards. And so we were able to do so also with the assistance of several asylum experts who by that point we had been working with on cases in Dilley, and who were able to review a lot of our work, and in addition to Alora Mukherjee, who's now one of our board members and some of our other board members, Mike Wishney, who's our clinical professor from Yale, Michelle Mendez, who's at Clinic, and with their assistance, we were able to obviously be successful in terms of those motions to reopen, but also create templates and make it possible not only for our own volunteers to pick up and figure out how to write a motion to reopen for the first time, but also we've now disseminated these resources to hundreds of attorneys, and including a lot of traditional legal service providers who before then maybe wouldn't have felt comfortable taking on a case with someone who already had a deportation order because of the fact that there's this sort of extra complicated first step of having to overturn the deportation order before getting into the actual crux of an asylum case. And so I think what has been really amazing about our work with ASAP is not only obviously how I feel about the fact that we've been able to help these families, which has been an incredibly rewarding experience, and but it's also, I think, taught us a lot about the possibilities of providing representation remotely. And so while many people initially told us it wasn't possible, we've now created a model where we're showing every day when we're successful in doing these cases and in providing rapid representation that it is possible to do remote legal aid, and that it's important to think about moving forward, especially at a time where there's so much need throughout the country, throughout the world, and oftentimes resources are kind of bunched up in certain big cities and urban areas, like in New York City or in DC or in San Francisco. And so understanding that maybe that's where most of the lawyers are or where most of the funding is, understanding that we can still be based. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. I can still be based here in Washington, D.C. and be working on cases for families who live in rural North Carolina, who live in rural Washington State, and it's no less important than if I were working on cases here in the D.C. metro area. And we're not by any means trying to say that traditional legal aid representation of having an attorney and a client meet in person is that we're trying to say that that's not a good idea moving forward. That's actually preferable, and we recognize that, to have someone in the same city. We oftentimes have to use volunteers locally to go with people to a meeting, to go with them to a hearing, and so it's better to have people in your own community, but it's also not realistic for us to think that that's always going to be the case. It doesn't mean that those families don't deserve legal aid, that they don't deserve representation.
Were you ever able to do hearings remotely where the attorneys were piped in? If you mentioned that already, I apologize.
No. Actually, we did in one
ICE
case.
was open, or the immigration court was open?
Yeah, what they had going on in the Dilley detention facility was that even though the individual who was in proceedings was in Texas, the ICE attorney and potentially, if the person had representation, was in Miami immigration court with the judge. And so I was actually able to represent a client who was in Dilley, who I never met in person, but I was in Miami along with the ICE attorney and the judge in the courtroom, and so we were all coming in through video for her, and she was coming in through video for us. But that's more because of the fact that that's where the judge was, that was possible. So we haven't yet, we've tried to do, and we've been successful in doing a lot of telephone appearances for scheduling hearings, but not for a long merits hearing, which takes oftentimes an entire day. But obviously we would be open to doing that. We have found that if you tell an attorney who wants to help someone that you're going to prepare their entire case for them beforehand, and you're going to have experts look at it, and all these people are going to work on it, and all they have to do is show up to court, and we're even going to write a list of questions. We'll work with you beforehand. People are very open to that kind of volunteer experience in court. So we have not had so much trouble finding people who are willing to do that. I think the part that is difficult is finding one person who's willing to do everything. And so we've been able to break that down by breaking down what it takes to actually work on a case. And in a lot of ways, for asylum cases now, where we're seeing backlogs of 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it makes more sense to, kind of interject at some point in someone's case, helping them file an asylum application, maybe they go unrepresented for a while there isn't necessarily a lot going on in their case, but then we're able to find them an attorney to come in and represent them later on. But they might have had a 5-year-long process during which time several different attorneys or volunteers have come in and out of their lives. Maybe it's not ideal in terms of the individual, but again, it's better than them not having that representation at all. And so I think that that's a big thing that we want to explore in the future of how we can continue to grow that model in different directions as it relates to asylum seekers.
First, I just have to applaud you. The innovation in this is just mind-boggling. I know you're pressed for time, but